Maybe to just kick us off, I'll ask the panel a question. So I'm curious for each of you to kind of reflect on where you think the consumer sits in a lot of this. I've seen a lot of kind of different approaches from what might be, front and center to the life of a Bermudian in how they manage their water and cost you're willing to pay, versus if I'm on a global stage, maybe I'm not connected to my food. And so your thoughts about, pay-as-you-go, policy, behind-the-scenes interventions, or even marketing to consumers about how water is used in their lives. So your perspectives. Anyone who wants to jump in?
Well, maybe I'll answer that from being a consumer sitting in the state of California and working in agriculture. Like many environmental issues, I feel like the consumer is happy to point fingers at how much water agriculture uses without really internalizing that they are the users of agriculture. They are the consumers of the food that agriculture produces. So I think it's a very narrow lens at which they look at those issues. And what was interesting to me in the drought, we had a 5-year historic drought in California, record levels of water stress. And what I learned in that process is how much savings could be accrued through conservation and water use efficiency in urban areas. The average Californian, I think, uses at least twice as much water per capita as the average Australian. And Australia has a very high standard and high quality of living. So clearly in California, we could make enormous progress on savings in urban water use so as to make sure there's some water left for agriculture. I should say that efficiencies I gave a talk on the use of technology to improve efficiency gains. In California, there's really very modest improvements that can be gained in terms of water use in agriculture through efficiency. It was really the shift to drip irrigation where we saw a massive improvement in efficiency. And at this point, it's pretty modest how much we can move the needle and how much water is used for food production. So where we can really get those high impact conservation is in the urban sector, because that water is truly removed from the system. It never goes back. It doesn't recharge our groundwater the way irrigation used to. So it really struck me how unfortunate it is that consumers don't see themselves as part of the solution to an environmental issue. And that probably is an issue, it probably applies to many environmental dimensions, but water in particular. And when you compound that with the fact that there's increased urbanization all over the world, and certainly in California, the default is always going to be making less water available for agriculture. And we have done that in California, and it's resulted in less acreage. At some point we can't do that in every place in the world, or we won't have an adequate food supply. So we're just pushing off the problem by the consumer not seeing themselves as part of the solution in the way that they use water. And that's why I think, examples like Bermuda put it all together because they have to. They don't really have a choice.
Thank you. What do you do? I think Josette really basically covered the ground very well. Since I was talking about the whole world, I presume you don't want a country-by-country analysis answer to your question. But the issue is that consumers don't see themselves, and I think part of the reason for this is pricing, because all around the world there's a great reluctance to charge sufficiently for water services. And I keep saying to people, if you're a real water person, please don't talk about selling water, you're selling water services. And that starts to make all the difference, because people can't object to paying for services, whereas there's all sorts of religious and philosophical and even poetical objections to paying for water, but nobody objects to paying for water services. Josette's just made the point, because she says consumer water doesn't get used again. It has to. So therefore, that's the reason that in my presentation I said, reuse of water is non-optional. We've now got to get on with it more seriously than we have been in the past. Canada is a very interesting issue. We share with Dubai the dubious distinction of using the most water per person. Oh my God, Dubai, because they produce it all when, they exist strictly on desalinated water, and so therefore when they're running their desalination, there's no limits to the amount of water that, as long as the oil-fired or oil-powered desal plant is running, they're producing both electricity and water. So therefore, actually they do reuse some water, but there's no particular limits, and they have no idea how much the process costs because it's related to the global price for hydrocarbons. Canada has a real problem in water policy because we're convinced, because the world keeps telling you, well, you've got 7% of fresh water. Well, yes, but a good part of that is in 2 million lakes north of anywhere that most places have ever been in, most people have ever been in Canada. And I often say to people, you want a lake? I can arrange to get you a lake. You go 700 miles north of the Tropic of, and then you go 800 miles east, and I will even call it after you. Now you own a lake. What are you going to do about it? Because the water that we have is very useful to the environment. It is used by some First Nations, some of it. But basically, this is not water which you want to call part of the Canadian storage. And 80% of our population lives around the border. Our rivers flow north. We don't have, except in the West, we really don't have as much water as people perceive, but it's extraordinarily difficult to get Canadians to pay attention to the fact that we actually have water problems and water issues, because we have this myth of complete water abundance, and so therefore things like water quality and such issues are not a difficulty. I'm on a campaign, and I'm going to ask my Bermudian candidate, why he isn't using the gray water that comes from Bermuda's houses to clean that slightly and put it through toilets. Why are you running it outside and then bringing it back in, etc.? Because it seems to me that one of the problems to what Josette is raising, and one of the issues that I'm raising, is you do what Hong Kong and others have done, which is you have a lightly cleaned water that takes your gray water and then puts it through to toilet flushing, some lawn and garden work, etc. So we do have problems with this. We have some good water management, but we're pretty profligate overall, and it comes from this national myth that we're swimming in the stuff, and so therefore we really don't need to take it as seriously as we take some other issues. So I hope that's on the way to changing, but I'm not really absolutely certain. So. And we're highly risk averse in doing the science that would actually bring in a lot of changes. If you want to change in wastewater treatment, something has to have been in use in other countries for X number of years. Well, this really does a lot for our university and science creators. I look at what the Dutch do in terms of coming up with new ways of treating wastewater. And then they go to a water board in the Netherlands and they say, yeah, let's try this, and if it works, we'll export it. Your turn.
I don't really think I have anything to add.
No, I'd love to hear your perspectives on how the population here is engaged or not. Any lessons learned, since water clearly has got to be more of a daily thought than maybe in some other countries.
I think because it hits the bottom line so quickly. I mean, if you literally run out of water, you may not be able to get a trucker if it's during a drought, because they're all heavily utilized elsewhere. So if you're not on a water main, then it's a real issue. So you have to monitor your water and be careful. Don't leave the tap running when you're doing your teeth and things like that. You just learn to be more conservative. But the water mains are expanding, and so people are starting to lose that perspective. It tends to be some of the older community that will be thinking more along the lines of water management. There was other things as well I didn't touch on the presentation. I mean, if we're collecting water from the sky, obviously there's other things we're collecting as well. And the co-chairs did ask before I gave the presentation, how do you deal with bacteria? We have birds on the roofs, we have lizards on the roofs, and their waste ends up in the tank. Well, generally we just have particle filters for the main water that comes into the house, usually 500 micron. You'll then get a finer micron activated carbon and possibly another filtration on the drinking water, but generally the other water is straight out of the tank, and we tend to not have any ill effects from that. I mean, if you're coming here for the first time, it may take a while for your gut flora maybe to adjust. But as I explained to my colleagues last summer, I went to do a triathlon in British Columbia, in fact, in Penticton, where they apparently not superchlorinate, but they highly chlorinate their water. And all of the people that came from Bermuda had problems when they were there. We couldn't deal with the water, I was choosing Coca-Cola during the race, which I never do.
God.
I know, and it was better than the water, just from a personal point of view. So that can be an issue, and the other issues we have to deal with as well is any soot falling on the roof ends up in the water tank. The soot can obviously come from the electrical generator, from the incinerator, and also from the vehicles. And what we find is that the level of polyaromatic hydrocarbons and dioxins and furans are very, very low. They tend to be contained in the sediment in the bottom of the tank. They have a very low solubility, so you don't get them coming up into the water. And if you look at the proportions of all the different dioxins, it doesn't reflect the signature of a mass burn incinerator. It doesn't reflect the signature that we get from Belco, the electricity generator, when they're burning heavy fuel oil. It literally reflects a vehicle source. So the vehicle soot is basically an issue. And we see in a lot of the publications, the proximity of where you live relative to some of the major highways is directly proportional to the types of cancer or receiving cancer in the first place, the frequency of that. So that is a concern. In terms of mitigation measures here in Bermuda, as I said, it's low solubility, so you shouldn't get it, and there are particle filters because it will be associated with particles, but you can also get first flush diverter devices, so when you're collecting the rainwater from the roof, the first wash of 10 or 20 gallons gets lost, and then you collect what's left. So, that's just a couple of things I thought about.
I'm guessing the reason the roofs are white is because of the titanium dioxide in the paint, so you're also getting some UV disinfection, no?
There is a bit of titanium dioxide, but typically they were white because it was originally applied with lime, and it was the lime that was the antiseptic, and now the white roof is actually a requirement for Bermuda developments aesthetically. But some of the paints do have titanium dioxide with the associated benefits with UV light, so yes. Yeah.
Please. Oh, I don't think it's on. Okay.
I can hear me. So I wanted to see if you could reflect a little bit about the impacts of different chemical, pesticides, and chemicals, and how that's affecting water use and water availability.
Oh.
Water use and water availability just went up.
Well, I can't speak to all chemicals, for example, pesticides. It's an area I really have no expertise, but I can speak to the problem of fertilizer, particularly nitrates. And from a couple of different perspectives. Again, from my sort of previous work with UC Davis, probably one of the things that's going to drive the next degree of efficiency in irrigation technology in California is actually a water quality regulation around nitrates in groundwater. In some parts of the state where there is intensive agriculture, think about the Salinas Valley where majority of salad that you consume in the United States comes from, there's very high levels of nitrates in groundwater that have percolated down from use of fertilizers, and that has serious implications for the fact that most of those communities rely on groundwater for drinking water. So it's non-compliant with the clean drinking water laws, and that has driven new regulation that will force farmers to more precisely balance the mass balance of nitrogen that goes onto their fields. And that's actually a big driver for some of the technology applications. Because we have drip systems, you are delivering water and fertilizer simultaneously, and those nitrate regulations are a big driver for farmers trying to use this new advent of technology to be more precise in that process. At EDF, in our agriculture program, we work entirely on the problem of fertilizers and their impact on the environment from a water quality perspective as well as a greenhouse gas emissions. And it's, there is definitely no one solution to that problem. We're talking about changing practice on millions of independent farms, independent operators. And so no one solution will work. It's probably a combination of technology, incentives for farmers to share the cost of those changes and share the risk of those changes with other concerned parties, be it the federal government or state governments or municipalities. There's a lot of different models people are trying out to use incentives to share the cost and the risk of those changes, as well as regulatory comes into play. But definitely I would say that the problem of the impact of agriculture on water quality worldwide is as much of a looming problem as the scarcity of water, because it really is quite pervasive. And if you think about, we have a problem in the United States, you look at fertilizer use in places like India and China, which have groundwater contamination problems that make those of us in California feel like we don't have a problem, let alone the eutrophication of rivers, lakes, and estuaries. So it's an issue that comes back to people in a very real way in terms of human health as well as from an environmental standpoint. So it's one that's definitely opportunity for a lot of different approaches.
So let me extend on that. Iowa has been having nitrate problems like you wouldn't believe. And best management practices and everything else are not going to reduce it. But interesting low-tech observations have been found, putting in a wood chip bioreactor, literally alongside the drainage of an acreage, basically. You bury wood chips. In the process of anammox in this whole thing, that nitrogen gets converted to nitrogen gas. So literally the levels can go from heavily contaminated down to normal groundwater levels within a very fast time. And the reason why they're having to do that is, for instance, many of the places have tile drain systems, and there's no way, whatever you do in terms of management practices. So that's one issue, that there are natural processes out there that we can enhance to reduce the nitrogen input. Phosphorus, I was just asking, they don't have a phosphorus problem here, and it's because of the calcium carbonate that makes up this. So we're actually looking at using Bahamian sand, which is, believe it or not, being shipped up. This material has a phenomenal capacity to bind phosphate because it's an aragonite rather than a calcite. And we actually put it into one of these water prizes things. We can remove 85% of the phosphorus, and the big advantage is after it gets saturated, we can hit it with citrate and remove the phosphate and reutilize that sand again and again. So there are treatment options for us, having put a legacy of 20, 40 years worth of nutrients on our land to get it back down to normal levels.
Jeff?
Yeah, Jeff Smith, ILSI Southeast Asia region. So I'm the other Jeff Smith in the room, the one from Singapore, not from Bermuda. Very nice presentation today. In Singapore, of course, we do recycle a lot of water. We take wastewater, and some of it goes back into drinking water and other uses. So the technology is available and practical, but not every country could accept that at this stage. Questions about drivers in two areas. So there was some mention of the fact that, was it 80% of the wastewater in the world goes straight into rivers, at least in some parts of the world? Only in Asia. But I did live in Europe for 6 years, and I was surprised and a little bit shocked to discover how many cities were still dumping raw sewage into fresh waters in Europe, but in Asia. So what could be the driver to move that forward other than trying to shame them? And a little bit also for precision agriculture. So taking Josette's point that consumers need to reduce, yes, but agriculture still is the biggest. drip irrigation reduces water usage by 80–90%. It's not very expensive. What could drive that more effectively than so far now?
Okay, let me start on that. First of all, Singapore has some really interesting technology and practices, but something that doesn't get mentioned half enough is that when PUB was putting together all these great technologies, they spent almost as much money on public education and on helping Singaporeans understand what was going to happen, what the dimensions were, etc. This is not something that they, after you finish the plant, you say, oh, we should tell people what we're doing. You know, it was the antithesis of this. You know, every time you went to Singapore, you got a T-shirt and you know, and got an education in what was now happening to their very radical and interesting water uses. The question about drip irrigation, you're right. It is relatively inexpensive. It is part of the general neglect of the agricultural sector in many countries, particularly in Africa, which leads, when you neglect your agricultural sector and you don't pay them enough for what they produce, they are going to stay in about the situation that they've been in forever, particularly in terms of being informed. This is starting to change because of the cell phone and because of more interest in reaching markets. And that's happening in a lot of African countries, but there isn't the market for agricultural improvements in a lot of countries that there are in countries where the agricultural sector is composed of people that have been educated in agriculture. As more than one person said yesterday, people's ambition in agriculture is just to get off the land. Where the problems are worse, that is the situation. So therefore, if you're trying to get off the land, you're not particularly thinking about something that's going to improve your agricultural production. Where agriculture starts to improve, drip irrigation is one of the things that comes in very quickly. Development assistance programs, banks, international agencies, multilateral agencies do this. But more important, the private sector is now starting to use drip irrigation and improved seeds as marketing. And as farmers have just a little bit more money, you'll find receptivity to these things. So yes, there is some market for this now. But it's been a very slow market in developing relative how quickly it moved into California, for example. Josette, you gonna?
Just to add to that on the drip irrigation, I would underscore it does take education and facilitation of farmers to see the opportunity that drip represents for a low-income smallholder farmer in Africa or even South Asia. It probably is going to take a little bit of education and potentially a little bit of assistance. But what's really interesting about drip is that it actually can have a very high return on investment in terms of improved yield. And that can be, again, by using water very efficiently in regions where there's very little water infrastructure. I mean, I come from a state where we have the world's most developed water infrastructure, probably in the world. We spend about 30% of our energy moving water around our state. So you don't want to buy a lake and move it to your house in Canada, let me tell you. But even in California, the move from furrow irrigation for tomato production to subsurface drip actually increases yield. So farmers see that very quickly, and they pay for the shift in their irrigation system. And that's true. The improvement in yield is going to be seen all over the world, where you have potentially limited amounts of water because you don't have infrastructure. So if you're a smallholder in sub-Saharan Africa and maybe you have a pond nearby, so you have a very limited amount of water that's available, by using drip you can increase yields with relatively low water requirement versus the farmer that Margaret showed in India, which benefited from almost too much infrastructure. So the yield benefit is very clear, and there are very low-cost, gravity-fed drip irrigation systems that even a number of smallholder farmers can access. But it's a question of making sure that's part of the the education and availability of those systems around the world. I want to just add one other thing that I was thinking about on the question of water quality that was asked earlier, and that is a couple other things. One is, we didn't talk so much about the problem of water quality for the food industry, but if you think about food processing, you absolutely have to start with high quality water in the food processing industry. And we've seen around the world companies, global food companies as well as local ones, been attacked for potential toxins in the water that is used, particularly in the beverage industry, but in others as well. So for food companies, having access to a clean supply of water is really critical to their operations as well as their reputational liability. And then again, sort of thinking about the unique situation in Iowa where the Des Moines Waterworks was suing 2 rural counties in a state that relies heavily on agriculture for its state GDP. Really, I think we have to increasingly understand that water quality really matters in terms of the social license to operate for agriculture. Again, I'd like to think consumers start to really understand where their bread and their butter comes from. But by the same token, it is a reality that whether you're a farmer or you're a food company who might have some discharge, your ability to be a good water steward is increasingly becoming part of the environment in which you operate, and where you have to start taking it as a higher priority and a serious risk.
Christy.
Hi, Christy Reimers, Conagra Brands. And I would say my interest in this topic probably comes as much from being a Iowa farm girl as working for the food industry. You know, it occurs to me, I never knew about the statewide crisis with water in Iowa, which tells me my family, farmers, are probably very much like other Iowans, where it's kind of like this. You know, if it hasn't affected me on my farm yet, it's probably not a big problem. Although I know they drink, their Culligan water. They don't drink tap water because it's not safe to drink. So my question, though, is could we discuss more about the role of plants and seeds and drought-resistant crops, and really what is the future of that in our water conservation, as opposed to, or in addition to, looking at better use of being better stewards of the water, per se?
Well, I can certainly start. This has been a major area for science, which is trying to improve the yields and improve the drought resistance, the flood resistance too, because floods are as much a problem. And if you've got a crop that disappears when you've got a flood, you've got as much of a problem as you do a crop that disappears when you've got drought. And I would say that there has been extraordinary progress that's been made by both the public sector and the private sector, because for the private sector, this is a major area of the future. I mean, I've had the experience of being in an African village and having a woman come up and saying to our group, when can we get the new seeds? When can we get the seeds that you can grow when it's dry? Now, the interesting thing also is that those seeds are probably being developed from sources close to her, because you have to go out to people that have lived in drought areas and then get their seeds and work on the characteristics in their seeds that allowed them to withstand drought and to increase yields. So the answer to your question is going on. There is an 800-pound gorilla in the room called GMOs, because one of the quickest ways to get to real change in seeds is through genetic modification. The new CRISPR technology may help move around that a little bit, but basically the reason this hasn't gone further faster in the rest of the world is definitely related to GMO resistance. But you can get there by conventional plant breeding eventually, and that is happening. And new and improved seeds are going out around the world, and they will continue to go. And the problem is, of course, making sure that you still get high yields out of this, because that's what the farmer needs, and that's what the consumer needs. So the news is somewhat moderately optimistic.
So maybe I can add on that. It's a great answer. I think the one other dimension to bring in is climate change and kind of the growing regions. And so that's probably one additional dimension where water comes into play is not only the water use efficiency of a seed, but also where that might need to be grown in the future.
Just to continue to add, since that is my area of expertise, which water is not. No, this is great. I do think they're a very important area of active research, from everything from classical breeding to using new genetic technologies. I would say that the really high value proposition of improved water use efficiency or drought tolerance in crop breeding is more about optimizing yield and sustaining yield, creating a more predictable yield from year to year than it is about water conservation. Plants have to have water to grow, and the amount of improved water use efficiency or drought tolerance that you can get through breeding is absolutely valuable from a yield standpoint. It doesn't do much to actually change the total water demand of growing a crop. So it's not so much a conservation practice as it is an absolutely important way to reduce the amount of risk that farmers face from variable weather, particularly in light of climate change or in light of rain-fed systems where variability rules the day. And that's the benefit of irrigation, is it reduces that variability. So it's a really important advancement, but it's probably going to do very little to impact total water demand from agriculture.
So maybe just to conclude, given, again, bringing it back to kind of a food industry related audience, is there any other piece of advice or things to watch out for from the panelist perspective, either challenges, commodities, locations, or opportunities that you would have this group think about?
I feel like I'm speaking a little too much, but actually I was really struck by Jeff Smith's presentation about here in Bermuda and want to take that up to the food level. In the many examples he gave of different layered approaches that they use to improve the stewardship of water on this island in terms of how much water is used and how it's cleaned up and how you're using it to recharge the system for the long run. What was really striking to me is that, layering that in the combination with Margaret's point about there's very little policy appetite to address water by governments until you get to a really critical thing. But even in Jeff's presentation, what you saw was major actors in the system, i.e. a hotel, for example, having to take on the responsibility because they need to make sure we have water when we turn on our shower and that we don't get sick when we brush our teeth using that water. And I think that's really analogous in the food industry as I start to see the growing operations of many global food brands and the rising business opportunity for domestic food brands in the developing world and the transition economies, where they really have to take on the problem of water oftentimes themselves. There isn't a good policy at the national level in many of these countries that can ensure that they have the water that needs to go into their food or beverage plant, and to make sure that that water is not only supplied regularly, but that also is of quality that's not going to create real risk for that company. And so I think the kind of examples that even Jeff gave us here in Bermuda are indicative of the types of things that I see increasingly the food industry having to address on their own as they expand the serving the middle class in these large parts of the world where you have developing and transition economies. Of course, there's always a lot of work for us in the developed world to do too, as Margaret pointed out.
Any other thoughts?
Yeah, just to add to that, food security for Bermuda is obviously a big issue. We're highly dependent on container ships coming from the States. We also, I heard in the presentation this morning, have a lot of aging farmers whose sons and daughters don't want to take on the industry, so that's a challenge as well. But at the same time, we do have a lot of entrepreneurs that are looking to expand hydroponics on the island, and that is definitely growing. And as government, as a regulator, we are trying to work to encourage, to collect data for the very first aquaponic system, where we would look to grow fish on land and then take the wastewater and then feed a greenhouse system then appropriately as well. And touching on the water drip irrigation as well, the farmers do that here, and I've realised when that was mentioned that the only time I've ever seen water spraying, besides somebody spraying their lawn at home, is usually the golf courses, and those tend to be the ones connected to the hotels that can reuse the treated wastewater to the appropriate standard, and so they have a ubiquitous amount of water already with, in this case, if it hasn't come into contact with the limestone, already with an appropriate amount of nitrates and phosphates in it, which is perfect for sustaining their fairways and greens. But yeah, and it just touched a point really. I've never seen a farmer spraying, so the drip irrigation is very silent and hidden.
Okay, so just a quick reminder for those who are interested, it can take about 10 people on a tour within the hotel. Please come up and talk with Heather at 12:30. But join me in thanking our excellent panel on water management. Thank you.